So I've been holding on to this experience for about a year now, and have decided to share it with you guys, mostly to get it off my chest. I work in a deep underground potash mine. For anyone who has never experienced what it's like to be several thousand feet underground, it's a very uncanny experience. There's no natural lighting, and usually the only artificial light comes from your cap lamp or any vehicles you're operating. You can hear the earth shift and the vast weight above you slowly bear down on the tunnel you're working in. I had been working underground for about 6 months and was being sent to an abandoned part of the mine to make it safe enough for crews to be sent in to recover some equipment and machinery that had been left behind. The area I was being sent in was infamous for being the location a mine operator, that I will refer to as Chris, had been killed by being pinched in between two pieces of equipment and having his torso split in half. The accident had shaken a lot of the guys underground, and many refused to work in that area again. So, as the junior operator, I was the unlucky bastard that had to go in. I was sent in by myself to get the job started, and was supposed to get another operator to come help me once I was ready. The beginning tunnel had so much potash dust piled up over the years that it reached my knees and made it almost impossible to see while driving in my bolter, a vehicle that drives 8-foot metal bolts into the ceiling to prevent the ceiling from caving in. I remember feeling so uneasy while I was in there, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Once I got to my first location to start bolting, I began setting everything up. I was setting up bolts when I noticed a moving light coming from the opposite end of the tunnel from where I had entered. I initially thought it could be another worker that was also doing work in the tunnel, so I started doing cap lamp signals, our own form of sign language with our light so we can communicate. I signaled for whoever was making the light to come towards me. Once I made that signal, the light stopped moving and after a few seconds, disappeared. I was becoming worried and tried to reason to myself what the light could be. It really couldn't have been another worker, because it wasn't safe to go to any farther until my work was done. It couldn't have been a piece of equipment, because it responded to my light. I was terrified and honestly didn't know what to do. I was scared to attempt to leave because my bolter kicked up so much dust. But I also didn't want to go by foot because I'd only have my cap lamp for lighting. I decided to stay camped inside the bolter till my backup arrived. The light never returned, and when my co-worker arrived, I gained enough confidence to finish the job and leave. I don't know what I saw, but I can't help but think it's the soul of Chris. The idea of his soul being trapped in that tunnel really bothers me, and I actually left the underground for a surface position, partially because of this encounter. When I was little, my parents rented this house. Spoiler alert, it used to be a security house used by narcos, where they kept kidnapped persons. We found out years after moving out, as it came out in the newspaper at the time. It had two facades, two entries completely different, ended on different streets as well. One entry was blue, and the other one was beige. It also had two different numbers. A lot of bedrooms, all of the mirrors were broken, and I mean all of them. All the locks were outside the rooms. They told my parents that it was because the owner of the house had small children. It had an inside pool, but we never used it as it felt strange. It wasn't deep enough as well. It was just a room with a pool in it. No windows in that room. The house was huge, to be honest. We stayed 1 year at that house. It was awful. My sister and I, at the time 10 and 8, were the ones that stayed more in that house with my mom. My dad travelled a lot for work, and when he was there, nothing would ever happen. My mom also never felt or saw anything. I never slept alone. It felt like someone was watching me all the time. My sister began to speak to someone there. I caught her talking to it several times, but she denied it. One day she screamed in the shower, and when my mom went to see what was going on, she had scratches all over her back. This happened to me too, but I didn't feel them. I just saw that I had them in the mirror when I used the same bathroom. but I didn't say anything. I don't know why. I just kept quiet about it. We never used that bathroom again. One night, we were watching the TV in the living room, and my mom called us to sleep. We got up, and I turned down the TV. When we were at the stairs, the TV turned up again. I went back to the living room to turn it off. When I turned, I saw a black shadow in the kitchen looking at me. It had a humanoid form, like a very big man. And I just stared at it, as you could see through him. It had a human form, I mean. He just kept staring at me with a defensive posture. I don't know how to describe it. Suddenly, my sister took my arm and told me in a dead serious tone, "Do not look at him." That's when I understood I was seeing a ghost. We ran as fast as we could to my room. My mom checked it out, but there was no one there in the house, just the three of us. To this day, my sister doesn't want to talk about it. It was horrible. You could just be doing your homework in the dining room and suddenly you could hear a man screaming like they were killing him in a horrible way. It echoed through all the walls. We cried a lot to move out of that house, but we were in the new city. My mom really didn't have any money to move out with my dad. Those are a few stories I have of that house. I have a few more I don't want to remember, to be honest. I just kept them closed in my memories. I grew up in a very historically rich area of my state. My town was founded in the mid 17th century and was occupied by the British during the Revolutionary War. I had a friend in elementary school who had lived in a very old home on the corner neighbourhood off of our town's main street. It was a large two-floor colonial home with a beautiful interior, plenty of rooms and spaces. It was used as a headquarters of sorts for a British officer, a general if I recall correctly, but isn't registered as any kind of historical site as far as I'm aware. At the date of this incident, I had been going over his house maybe around a year or so. I had been told it was haunted and shown their basement, which was a small, old wooden door that opened up to what I would call a dark cave. The basement sloped downward as if it had been dug by hand and lined with fieldstone. On the wall remained old iron chains and hooks, which the parents claimed were used to chain up British prisoners, not slaves to my knowledge. One night, I recall I couldn't sleep well, as was typical for me at a sleepover as a kid. I remember being a little afraid and on edge that night. I know my friend was asleep, so I tucked myself under his bunk bed, mostly covered with a view of the door to my left and windows straight ahead. I flipped on my grey brick Nintendo DS and loaded up Pokemon Diamond, volume off so as not to wake anyone up. Somewhere around 4 a.m, I heard shuffling coming from the other end of the upstairs where the bedrooms were, coming from down the hall where the parents' master bedroom was. I dismissed it, as his father was a burly 6'4", 300-pound guy. But the pacing didn't stop, it carried on, which startled me. What the hell would his father be doing this for at 4 a.m? It carried on for no more than a couple of minutes. Down the hall, back up, back down, then silence. The steps stopped around the bedroom door to my friend's room. My heart was racing and I put down my DS and lowered the blanket that had sat over me to look and see. I saw the old glass and brass doorknob to his bedroom turn, and the door opened. I looked all over the frame. I didn't see a thing. I didn't hear anyone, see anyone, nothing. It stayed open for a few seconds and then began to close. What terrified me was the knob to the door had begun to turn as the door closed, as to not cause the tick when the door would shut. In my position, I could see both ends of the door, and there was no hand on the knob as it turned. The steps returned, pacing down the hall, rhythmically, and disappeared at the stairs. I don't remember much else, other than taking my skateboard and going to Dunkin' Donuts maybe 3 hours later. I couldn't wait to get out of the house, but my friend wasn't going to wake up for me, lol. When I had mentioned it to him, I simply remember him saying something along the lines of, "Told you it was haunted." I wish I had something to say about the basement, but for good reason, I stayed away. I do remember that it was one of the last times I spent the night there. That was that. It was by far the most interesting experience to date that I have memories of. I'd like to share a number of little anecdotes from my dozens of times being at the notoriously haunted and long abandoned cemetery, Bachelor's Grove. I think they rival a lot of the stories to come out in the last 20 years about experiences in that cemetery. For one, among the first times I went to the cemetery, which is situated in the middle of a forest preserve, it was with friends, and we saw the notorious disappearing house, or at least one of them. We didn't even know it was supposed to be there. Once we had spent our time in the cemetery, we continued walking west, past a stream that ran through the area. We walked for some time, and I even took a photo inside of a nearby well where this house apparently was, attached. This was in approximately 2001. The house that most people have reported is said to be white, but what we saw was brown. It did look like it had candles in the windows, and it had a sheltered porch area. The more we walked towards it, the more it stayed the same distance from us. We were so preoccupied with looking for ghosts that we didn't even realise that the house wasn't supposed to be there. And we didn't put it together for some years after, including several other visits without consequence, and one with an especially large amount of consequence, at least to me. After I heard about the disappearing house in 2004 or so, I brought multiple friends back to try and find it, and we never did. One time in 2014, a friend and I walked for 5 hours in the thick of the woods, off the paths, past the cemetery, past the nearby stream. And the more we walked, the more the view of the Midlothian Turnpike, i.e. at the end of the forest preserve, stayed the same distance from us. Finally, we gave up and turned around, and we got back to the cemetery entrance within 20 minutes. That forest preserve is about a 3-block radius if you look at a map. There's no logical way we walked for that long without coming out the other side. On Friday, June 13th of 2003, I was still something of a skeptic. I went to spend the night at the cemetery by myself because I thought I'd never see anything. I snuck into the forest preserve area past a small radio antenna/tower because I knew there would be police stationed at the main entrance to prevent trespassers, and there were. By this time, I'd been there so many times I knew the place by heart. I quietly snuck onto the main path just past the entrance. Once I'd walked through the woods for long enough, dressed in all black, and with a good deal of adrenaline, I didn't even have a flashlight, but I found that I didn't need one. The moon was so bright and full, yes, it was a full moon on Friday the 13th, that I didn't need a flashlight. I walked around a fair amount. I was thankful that for some reason there was no mud and no mosquitoes, and the weather was a bit brisk, but not too cold. I'm pretty sure that I arrived at the cemetery around 11 p.m, and not a thing happened until about 2 a.m. But at that time, everything happened, and it was beautiful. I sat at a grave that had been dug up in the 60s, so it was a bit of a pothole. I believe it was the Newman grave. I tried to settle in, but I was on high alert the entire time, until I did actually start seeing things. A lot of people have horror stories of shadow figures and deep negativity, but what I saw was so blissful and warm, it made me really happy, and I've always associated that warm feeling with the place since then. It began with me seeing 2 people slow dance in a circle, patiently, gracefully, and almost menacingly. It was a bride and groom in old-fashioned regalia. The groom with a top hat and coattails, and the bride with a white wreath on her head. They were too far away to see too many details, but the intensity with which they gazed into each other's eyes was not only implicit, but undeniable. So much so that I could hear the music, although I knew I couldn't. It's natural for a skeptic to assume that this was merely a mirage, the eyes playing tricks in the moonlight, but it's hard to explain how bright everything was. The moon was not only luminescent, but everything had a slight glowing hue to it, which allowed me to make for certain this couple in the distance, dancing their mesmerizing dance near the entrance to the cemetery, were not my eyes making something out of nothing. The more clarity I felt, the more happiness I felt. I felt as if I was connected to all of the families who had come to have picnics and visit their loved ones, since this was, after all, referred to as the cemetery in the park at one point. White orbs began to float around in the area, and they didn't seem to be representative of bodies, but they were smaller. They looked like what Disney movies portrayed lightning bugs to be, basically clusters of white superballs floating in the air. There was not only a glow, but a sort of fog in the trees. And most of the orbs that I saw up in the trees are what looked like light mists of glowing white smoke. To my left, a large glowing red light crept up over the lagoon, and the nearby Midlothian turnpike. It looked like red spotlights were coming up out of the lagoon, lots of them. The side of the road next to the lagoon was immersed in red light going straight up to the sky. I kept waiting to hear an ambulance, but I heard nothing. I didn't even hear crickets for a while. Combined with the moonlight, these new red lights gave me even more light to see, and on the ground, I saw a broken carriage and a dead horse. I want to be clear that it was bright enough to make these things out clearly. The carriage was pretty smashed up, but it was still recognisable as a carriage. I didn't know of any sort of history where a horse and carriage ran into the lagoon and both died for no apparent reason. I heard that years later. Another thing I will say, there are stories of a yellow man, which is to say, apparently some Dick Tracy type of character walks around in a yellow overcoat. I didn't see that exactly, and I never heard of it until recently. But what I did see was a glowing yellow humanoid figure that would walk for a few steps and then explode into pieces, then reform as a bunch of orbs that rapidly coagulated, walk a bit more, then explode. All of this happened in a manner as if it were indifferent to me. This stuff continued to go on, uninterrupted, for at least 2 hours. I sat in the moonlight and sketched what I was seeing at one point, and that was just as things were beginning to develop. What I did sketch also were potential mirages, to be clear, but that was before the red light really kicked in. It wasn't all peachy keen through the whole night, though. I had heard of the shadow figures and hooded figures, and naturally I was worried about ritual abuse and devil worshippers that are rumoured to be about the area. What I did see was hovering hooded figures moving back and forth about the fence area, paying particular attention to the entrance. They zoomed back and forth over and over, and that made me pretty nervous, but they seemed more like guardians than antagonists. What made me more nervous was that I began hearing animals screaming. I specifically heard a dog screaming in pain, and it felt like it was very close to me, but I couldn't see it. The dog didn't seem to want to hurt me, but I didn't move from my spot at that gravestone until the sun began to come up. Just before that happened, it was as if a dimmer switch had turned and everything down, and it all faded from view as the crack of dawn only slightly began to creep through the moonlight. At which point, I walked to a nearby diner, had breakfast, and came back to the cemetery to take pictures with a disposable camera. Naturally, not one photo came out. They were all completely black. My hubby is thoughtful. He had the best of intentions when he bought the old but safe 1984 Mercedes for myself and our daughter in 2002. The problem? The car was haunted. Not just haunted, it was possessed by something that didn't like me. I honestly felt it wasn't me specifically, it was the fact I was a woman. My hubby was excited because the car had history. It had been used in films and was owned by a famous divorce attorney. Yes, the car had been used in many films, and its primary owner was a prominent divorce attorney. However, he only represented husbands. That's important for later. Oh, also, he was found, passed away in his car. It always parked in our driveway, outside of our garage. Once parked there, our garage and also the room adjacent to the garage, our living room, remained incredibly dark. Even though our living room had an entire wall of windows, we could never seem to get enough light to see. There was a heaviness to the air too. Our daughter was petrified of the garage. Even now, though, the car had been gone for years, and she's now 25. She still turns on all the lights before entering the garage. My hubby was so excited with the car's history. Well, whatever the history, it was clear as crystal. The car didn't like me. Anytime I drove, it would stall and refuse to start. It would happen in bad places. The middle of the freeway was one, but its favourite was the middle of intersections. I would just be trying to get from point A to point B. Nope. I would call my hubby. I'm dead in the intersection again. Strangers are pushing the car as we speak. He sent the mechanic and the car was towed to his shop. The mechanic kept the car for 2 weeks, trying to duplicate the problem. No luck, it drove fine. All systems checked out. My hubby called me to say the car was ready. He picked me up and dropped me at the mechanic's shop. He stayed there to see that the car started. On the way home, it again stalled. I informed my hubby then. I no longer cared if he believed me. I refused to drive the car again. My husband was now the only driver. He never had an issue with stalling again. Once it wouldn't pass smog, it began to sit on our driveway and wreak havoc in our home. The darkness and negative energy was so thick, it was suffocating. We were arguing all the time over nothing. I'd come home in a good mood, only to feel frustration and anger once inside my home. This went on for years. Finally, we decided to get rid of the car. A tow company was scheduled to come take it away. I took pictures during the process. I was nervous, but excited to be rid of this evil. I still have the pictures. I swear to this day, there's a visible face in the driver's side rear window that changes expression as the car is being loaded on the trailer. Once the car was gone, my home felt lighter. It was brighter. We no longer needed lights in our living room that had a wall of windows. The heaviness was gone. The anger and frustration that we felt about each other was gone too. We just celebrated 32 years together. If we had kept that car, we'd be divorced, or one of us dead by now. That I'm sure of. Our neighbours had a cat named Wrangler. He used to come and visit us every day. My daughter used to love reading stories to him. I have pictures of the two of them sitting on our porch. He seems to be truly listening. One day he came over and I noticed a horrible wound on his backside. He'd obviously been in a fight. I went to my neighbours who owned him and asked if they knew about the wound. They affirmed they knew, but felt a vet visit wasn't needed. He's an outdoor cat, shit happens. I was stunned. I asked for permission to take him myself. They said, it's your money. He went on major medications and I had to clean and pack his wound daily. He was incredible through the whole process. In doing blood work, it was discovered he had feline AIDS. I was devastated. This meant his recovery would have to take place in our garage away from the other cat that I had inside my home. Our neighbours stopped caring for him completely. So after he fully recovered, he became our kitty. It kills me that I had to keep him outdoors. I knew the dangers that awaited him. My daughter insisted that we get him a collar and tag. It also had a bell. He seemed happy to be ours. We could hear his collar ring every time he came to bed. AIDS was horrible. He could never seem to get enough to eat. One morning, we didn't hear his bell. My daughter called for him. Once in a while he'd behave this way. He was a cat after all. My daughter asked if she could go look for him. I agreed and continued to make breakfast. Suddenly, I heard my daughter screaming. She ran into our home, clutching me, sobbing. I asked, "What's wrong, honey? What's wrong?" Through sobs, she said it was Wrangler. A coyote got him, and he was, what was left of him, on our neighbour's lawn. I grabbed a blanket and went to him. Almost all of him was there, be it in pieces. Obviously, the coyotes could tell he was ill. I scooped him up and we buried him under his favourite tree in our yard. For weeks after, we would hear his bell ring outside our door. We'd always check, but there was never anything there. We knew it was him, our wrangler, letting us know he was okay. My parents bought their home in the early 50s for $18,000 in California. My dad was extremely proud that it came furnished. What a deal! My dad was all about bargains. His favourite piece was a wall unit made of dark wood that had a grandfather-type clock built in the centre. My dad babied that unit as if it were a family member, cleaning and polishing it regularly, even talking to it. Don't misunderstand, he was brilliant. A microelectronic engineer. A genius, really. Fast forward to 1992, 2 days before Christmas. He dies suddenly of a massive heart attack, his second, in the living room. My mom grieves horribly for a very long time. We began talking to her about redecorating, using her inheritance from my dad to make the home her own. She finally agreed, and soon after the house was filled with workers. I happened to be visiting when I believe my dad voiced his opinion about the changes. A worker was looking to remove the family member unit from the wall. He thought my mom was nearby, so he loudly asked, "Hey, you want this clock unit removed?" He stated he heard a very loud affirmative no, so he didn't remove the piece. Later, my mom came through the room and noticed the only item left in the room was that piece. She asked the contractor, whom I'd been chatting with, why the piece was still on the wall. He left to speak with his workers, came back and said, "My guy says you said no very loudly. Is that not correct?" My mom responded, "He didn't ask me. I've been outside in the laundry room and backyard all morning." I truly believe that it was my dad. He was angry at the thought that his beloved clock might be replaced or removed. It's a favourite family story to this day. It's about 1 a.m. right now as I'm writing this. The story I'm about to share happened roughly 25 minutes ago. It's been a long night, and I'd just gotten home from hanging out with my friends. It's pretty late, so I decided to try and get some sleep. I usually sleep with some type of noise in the background, whether it be TV or a fan of sorts, but tonight was different. I decided I wanted to sleep with calm music on through my Bluetooth speaker. Everything was fine until about 3.5 songs in. All of a sudden, my music stopped playing. I didn't touch anything on my phone, and nobody else was able to connect to it, nor did it make the disconnect or reconnect noise. It was fully charged too, so there was no way it could be dead. After a few seconds of silence, a sudden sound of white noise is quietly playing on the speaker. Following that, what sounded like an old, raspy woman started whispering through it. It was hard to make out exactly what she said, not to mention I was shitting my pants at this point. It sounded like she said, "He's the one," but it might be a stretch. After a few seconds of her whispering, it stops. There's a final blip of white noise, and then it cuts off completely. My speaker is still on, but it's not connected to anything. I ran out of my room, and I'm writing this in another bedroom. I know ghosts like to tamper with electronics, especially knowing that I'm alone in a dark room. My house is also rumoured to be haunted by my family. Even the first time we had shown my grandmother it, the first thing she said was, "There's something here." My dad has mentioned seeing ghosts and even hearing them sometimes. So was this really a ghost trying to talk to me? Or possibly a malfunction with the Bluetooth and its radio? Please help me figure this out. I was a sophomore in high school when this happened. I haven't gone back. It's midsummer in New England, and my best friend, let's call him Anthony, and I are hanging out. I live on conservation land, so aside from the houses at the very front, there are no other developments and woodland that spans for acres and acres. The state put down some paths, so I suggested that we go exploring. We geared up, I brought my pocket knife, sprayed down in bug spray, and headed out my backyard. We hadn't explored too much, but I knew the area somewhat well, so we decided to hell with the trials. We're going to be real men and forge our own path. We enter the woods, thickly forested with pine, maple, and oak trees, and make notches in the trees on the way so we can find our way back. It's around noon, so I'm not too worried about it getting dark. After all, the sun sets around 8 p.m. in the summer, but just in case. We walk deeper and deeper into the woods. About 15 minutes and the forest is alive. Bugs, frogs, birds, everything in this forest is loud. Slightly irritating, truthfully, but it's nice to take in the sights and sounds. Soon, we stumble upon a peculiar scene. A perfect circle, probably 20 feet in diameter, that spans from the ground all the way to the sky. I'm perplexed, but Anthony is curious, so we decide to go in. The first thing I noticed is that the overgrown weeds and grass that surround us stop at the perimeters. All vegetation past the line is dead. Not bare, but dead, crunching under our feet. I don't just mean the grass either, but the tree limbs that extend in are also bare. Leaves down the branch until it crosses the line. Being the middle of summer, nothing should be dead, and I've never seen a branch behave like that. I'm feeling extremely uneasy. I turn to Anthony and ask him if he feels uneasy. He says he feels like we're being watched. I agree. It's then we notice the strangest scene. The entire forest has gone silent. Not in rest, but in what feels like suspense. I'm feeling very uneasy now, and I know that we need to leave. We run out of there following our tree marks, and when we get back to my house, the forest is alive. Ever since then, every summer, every winter, a snarl of branches, sometimes leafed, sometimes not, reveals our path through the forest. I swear that whatever was watching us from that circle, peers through, wants us to come back. I'm a Catholic, and I go through phases of devotion, but my faith is strong and I try to do good. I understand this leads me towards some explanations over others, but I'm truly at a loss for words with this one. It was early May of this year, 2021, and for Easter, my grandfather sent me a nice care package. I was a sophomore at a secular college at the time, and it was a sweet surprise. In the box was a bunch of assorted candies, a stand-up crucifix, and a small metal case adorned with an image of the Pope, and marked on the pack with the papal symbol and the Greek letters Alpha and Omega. I opened the clasp, and sitting on a thin lining of felt was a beautiful metal rosary. On each bead was a rosette, every marker for each decade, a set of 10 beads, a different saint and a location associated with the Vatican. I took it out of its case and rested it on my desk. Underneath was a small pendant, probably half an inch in size, and on it, Pope Francis with St. John's Palace on the back. Overall, it was just stunning. I noticed a note from my grandfather, and he wrote that the rosary was from his trip to Italy 2 years prior. It was made of silver, blessed by Pope Francis, and he noted he wants me to have it because I'm his special one. For those who don't know, May is the month of the rosary. In honor of Jesus and Mary, I resolved to do at least a decade of my rosary every day. I would go to my desk, take the case off the top shelf, and walk about 7 feet to my bed. I'd open the case, take the rosary out carefully, close the case, do my prayers, and then put it back in the case and on the shelf. I did this consistently for a week, and it became a time for reflection and general peace in the presence of God. One day, I went to do my routine and grabbed the case and brought it to my bed. I opened it, and the small pendant fell out when I took the rosary out. I heard it clink off my bedpost and hit the ground. I got on my hands and knees to look for it, moving boxes and my bedside table trying to find it. I couldn't. I did what any Catholic does when something gets lost. and I did a prayer of Saint Anthony. I was a little confused, but it wasn't the rosary itself, and I wasn't going to tear up my room looking for it since I was moving out in a month. Now, 6 days had passed, and I did my rosary every day, putting it into the case and back on the shelf. The pendant was still nowhere to be seen. I was feeling sluggish, so I decided to nap before doing my routine. I had a great dream, don't remember what, but woke up to my room being saturated with the smell of roses. Living on the third floor on a campus that doesn't believe in flowers, I was very confused. It was, however, time to do my rosary. I walked over to the top shelf, grabbed the case, and walked to my bed. I opened the case and pulled my rosary out. I felt my heart drop as underneath it was the pendant I lost a week ago. I felt it and it was warm, a contrast with the cold rosary in my hand. I knew it wasn't there before either, and I checked the paper thin lining to make sure it hadn't fallen underneath. I thanked God, but to this day, I'm perplexed by this experience, and I still can't explain it. I went to a veterinarian camp when I was about 15 years old, hosted by a zoological park in my state. It was a co-ed session where all the kids slept in a huge house together, with the boys upstairs and girls downstairs. One night, I was laying downstairs in the living room floor in my sleeping bag. In the way the house was set up, the living room had a vaulted ceiling that went all the way up to the second floor. You could see the upstairs hallway because there was a railing. The boys had just used the bathroom and went into their rooms for the night. For some reason, I was the last one asleep. The boys had left the bathroom door cracked and it suddenly swung open about 2 feet. It was weird to me, but could have been explained by the AC or something else. But it was midnight, and everything seems scarier at midnight. After that, one of the camp counselors came out of her room, asking if we were slamming cabinets shut. We weren't, and everyone was asleep. She went back into her room, kind of confused. On the doors in this house, there were alarms that sounded if they opened, along with a blinking red light that I assumed signaled if the alarms were alarmed or not. I was facing the kitchen, where there was a back door directly in my field of view. All of a sudden, the alarm starts beeping and the kitchen is pitch black. Keep in mind that I could normally see inside the kitchen at night due to outdoor lights and general light pollution in the area, but this time I couldn't. It was like a curtain fell on the kitchen and I saw absolutely nothing. I know this probably doesn't sound all that weird, but I had such an odd, heavy gut feeling that it was the night I was going to die. I couldn't move, but somehow I fell asleep. So this happened sometime in the middle of 2017. I'm not sure as for other countries, but here in Brazil, all houses are gated for safety. And the only places where you can find houses with their front doors leading directly to the street are enclosed condos. My friend James threw a small group hangout in his place. He lived in one of those condos with dozens of identical small houses. So it was maybe 5 or 6 of us clutched into a tight living room, having pizza and watching some shit on the TV. We were all going to sleep over that night, and as it is for every group we hangout we have, everyone would possibly spend the night awake. It was maybe around 1 AM when we all decided to go for a late night walk around the condo. It's pretty safe, with tall walls and a good doorman, as all condos should be, so it's always nice to walk around there. We all went slowly down the street, passing through many houses identical to his, talking quietly so we don't wake up the neighbours. Eventually we stopped by the empty children's playground and decided to climb the little wooden house. Kind of forgot the specific name for it now, but you guys know what I mean. Those small wooden house thingies with a ladder on one side and a slide on the other. There was enough space in it for all 5 or 6 of us to sit, talk, smoke and hang out. No one around, no annoying kids, just silence and peace for us to chill. Behind this playground, there was one of the condo's walls, and behind that wall, some woods with big trees looming over us. On the other side, the street, then the sidewalk and the many identical houses. Every two houses there was a light pole, lighting everything up. We were all talking about random stuff, listening to music at a very low volume on someone's phone, when eventually we ended up getting into the paranormal subject. As our topics came and went on spirits, ghosts, spooky stuff, horror movies, etc., and so forth, we noticed James, our host, get quite tense. He wasn't necessarily into the conversation and was visibly getting serious and gloomy. All of a sudden, he said something along the lines of, "Yeah, we shouldn't be talking about those stuff so nonchalantly and deliberately. It kind of bothers them." All of us knew James was a medium. He'd mentioned a lot of times how he'd always see spirits and interact with entities in his childhood, but ended up blocking that away. However, still seeing some stuff every now and then. Even those of us who weren't spiritual or anything respected him and never dared to doubt a thing, mostly because his grandma, who he still lived with and cared for, was highly spiritual and had many times confirmed to us that he was saying the truth. We all loved and knew her enough to know she wasn't bluffing or anything. She firmly believed it, he firmly believed it, and there was no reason we'd be dicks to doubt and question their beliefs. Therefore, when James said that, we all just nodded and changed the subject. A few minutes later, James was still a bit shook and went, "It's getting a bit late, and you're all kind of loud, guys. We're going to get cold out here. Let's go back and drink some more." We all shrugged, agreed, and hopped off the wooden house. Then, when we were all going up the street, James looked back apprehensively and said, "So as I said, please avoid talking about that stuff in that way, out of nowhere. He's been standing near that light pole looking at us since y'all first touched that topic." Needless to say, we all got terrified shitless and bolted up the street. Later on, we tried to talk to him into elaborating further what had happened. He clarified that the male entity meant no harm and was purely looking at us as if curious. I remember questioning James why he saw it, if he blocked that off his mind. And he said he'd been trying to sort of reconnect with the other side in hopes of seeing his deceased mom again. We don't talk much about spirits since then. So, quick background. I had two jinn, I believe all supernatural entities are jinns, experiences to date. The first occasion I'll narrate at a later date, since that happened when I was quite young, and I put less of an emphasis on it, even though it was scarier. So the second experience occurred while I was in grade 10. This was in my native country, Bangladesh. I was about 13 or 14 at the time, and was preparing for my O-levels examinations coming up in a month. I was studying late that night, while my brother passed out in my room. The door to my room was closed but unlocked. The act even happened at midnight, which is not really that late by Bangladesh standards, as the city doesn't really quiet down till like 1 or 2 a.m. That night, while working through some study material, my door suddenly crept open. I was facing the door, so I stared at it for a bit, but didn't really make much about it. Once I stare back down at my book, this shit happens again, and the door opens up a bit more. Once again I stare, and then go back to studying. Then it happens again. Now the door's open to a point where the light from my room should go right outside and let me see why the door keeps opening. This time I stare at the opening, but to my surprise, it's pitch black outside. It almost felt like someone was blocking the light, and I felt this presence stare directly at me. Now after a long-term stare battle, I reassure myself it's probably just the wind and go back to work. This time, a thin, curved, rusty metal rod comes through the door and bangs sideways between the door and the wall. I look at the thing and shout at it in a harsh tone. Right then, the metal rod goes back into the darkness, and I hear faint footsteps going into the living room. This was a weird experience, since there weren't any signs of a break-in. My parents were asleep, and they're room door was locked and no one else was inside the house. This is the narration of my other Din experience, first in chronological order. It's weird that I don't really get that scared when I recollect what happened, even though this was much scarier than my other later experience. It was in Dhaka, Bangladesh. It was the early 2000s. I was about 6 years old at that point, and like most Bangladeshi kids at that time, slept in my parents' room. We were pretty well off, but most parents during that period would rather use the spare rooms for other purposes. It was a winter night, and I was suddenly woken up sometime in the middle of the night. This was before the time there were cell phones. I felt my legs were quite chilly, and so I tried to get the heavy comforter on my leg. I looked back, and there was a face at the edge of the bed by my legs. No other body parts, just a face on the mattress, and its bright red eyes and mouth glowing in the dark. I stared at it for a while in disbelief. It then opened its mouth and asked me to come with me, I'm your uncle, in Bengali. I didn't speak, so he repeated the same instructions again. This time, I looked the other way and basically punched my mom with my outstretched arms, who was sleeping on the other bed near me. She woke up in a haste and I asked her to switch on the lights ASAP. When she had gotten up and switched the lights back on, the figure was gone. To date, I've still not forgotten that face on my bed. One thing to add is that my brother had a habit of sleepwalking during this time, and there was this time when my dad had to physically drag him from the entrance of our house to our room, as he kept on banging on that door to let him go outside. During the night this happened, he was sleeping beside me, so perhaps this entity, Jinn, tried its hand with me. In honour of Halloween, I thought I'd finally type up this story from Halloween 2015 and share it here. It's long. I promise it all connects. Halloween that year was on a Saturday night. Last minute, I decided to attend a friend's board-gamed theme party. I drew a Ouija board and an old white t-shirt with a Sharpie. It turned out great, and had a nice time at the party. The next day, Sunday, November 1st, I had a typical hungo Sunday. I left the costume on the floor in a pile of laundry that I was too lazy to pick up. I'm in bed that night with my dog and her eye starts swelling up out of nowhere. Like it was huge and she couldn't see. Her whole face was swelling. I panic and rush out to take her to the emergency vet. I go to get her out of the car at the vet, except when I do, all of the swelling is gone and she's completely fine. Being young and poor at the time, I decided to skip the emergency vet and went back home since my dog seemed completely normal. We get back in bed, and a couple of minutes later, my dog's face starts doing the same thing, just swelling up out of nowhere. I rush back to the emergency vet, and this time, even though the swelling disappeared again, I decided to admit her to the vet to get her checked out. They run tests and give fluids and check for insect bites, but nothing showed up. She was completely fine. We go back home. It's late. I pass out and so does my dog. No more face swelling. Cut to 3:30 in the morning. I wake up and my dog is sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall where my closet is and doing a low growl. I look in the direction of the closet and the door is open. And inside the closet, I see this dark black/grey misty thing, furiously clawing at my clothes on the hanger and making them swing back and forth. Terrified, I couldn't find my voice to scream, so I just lifted my hands in the air and slammed them down on the comforter to scare it away. It turned and looked at me. It didn't really have a face though, just like a hooded black hole. And then it vanished through the back wall of the closet. I didn't know how to process it. I thought I was maybe seeing shit. So I just sat motionless, wrapped as tightly as possible in my comforter until it was lights out. I burned the Ouija costume the next day and smudged with some sage just to be safe. That apartment was in a building built in the early 1900s, and I saw lots of ghosts after that. Every 6 months or so, I would wake up, always between 3 to 4 in the morning, and see a figure in my room. All of the other ones I saw were more neutral in terms of their energy. They were more white and misty, and had faces and weren't dark and faceless like the first one. I would ask them, please leave me alone, and they would disappear. Pretty harmless. I still don't quite know if what I saw was real, or just my mind playing tricks on me late at night. The one part that makes me think it was real was my dog's face swelling. I FaceTimed my mom that night. She saw my dog's face and told me to go to the vet, so I didn't imagine that. But was that the demon attacking my dog, or just a coincidence? I'm a rational person, but I swear that Ouija person costume opened up some sort of portal in the bedroom. So this is a story that happened in my hometown. In the 1980s, there was a police officer, let's call him John. John was the police of this town. It was midsummer, and there was very little to do. One day, one of the local reindeer herders came to his office. He said that he saw a boat flip on a lake, and he saw two people on the boat that fell over, and they weren't able to reach the shore. The weather was windy, so the waves were quite big, and he himself didn't have a boat to try and rescue them. So John decided he was going to at least try and retrieve the bodies. He asked one of the local herders if they had a boat in the neighbouring lakes that he could borrow. There was one person that had a boat, so the police borrowed it. So a couple of days later, John went up to the tundra. This lake was at the border between the tundra and the forest. He got the boat and arrived at the lake. He had a scuba set that he had brought with him. He rowed right above the spots where the people had fallen over. He put on his scuba gear and dove down. The water was a bit murky, but you could still see quite well. He managed to locate the bodies. It was a 40-year-old man and his 11-year-old son. He swam closer and closer and decided he was going to lift the body on the boat. Just as he was about to grab the child, he saw something at the side of him. The father's arm was almost reaching for him. He dodged the arm and took the child. He swam with the body to the boat and put it on the boat. He didn't think much about it. Maybe it was just the water that moved the arm. He dove down again to retrieve the father. Just as he was about to grab the body, the arm rose again. The arm tries to grab John, but he manages to dodge it. But now he's getting a bit nervous. What happens if the arm grabs him? He tries again, and sure enough, the arm is moving towards him. He freaks out and swims a bit further. He must get the body, as he has promised to retrieve them. He decides to take an oar and try to flip the body. He swims to the boat, grabs an oar, and swims back down and manages to flip it. He swims with the oar to the boat and dives down again. Just as John is about to grab the man's leg, the body quickly turns around and tries to grab him. He dodges again and is freaking out. He then decides to get his lasso to try and pull the body up to the boat. He swims back up, takes the lasso down. He quickly puts the lasso around the leg. Just as he gets us on, the arm is reaching for John. He swims back to the boat and starts to pull the body up. After a bit of struggling, he manages to get the father's body on the boat. He covers him in a tarpaulin and goes back to land. Then out of nowhere, a storm appears. It starts to hail and a giant downpour of rain. The weather in these parts can be unpredictable. He has no choice than to crawl under the tarpaulin and stay there until the storm goes away. He sits there for hours with the bodies. A couple of times, he could have sworn he saw the father's body move a little bit. The night goes by slowly, and in the morning, the weather starts to clear. He then hears the sound of an ATV. It's one of the herders. John crawls out to greet the man. The man decides to help him lift the body on John's ATV. John drives back to town, and the bodies are buried at the cemetery. John decided to never take those kinds of missions again. This is something that many people have experienced. So there's a town in northern Norway. People often travel to the nearest city to shop, visit the doctor, etc. Between the city and the town is a smaller town. Between the city and the small town is a canyon. So there was a man. Let's call him Baitar. Baitar was driving late home to his hometown from the city. It's late and a bit of snowy weather. He just drove through the canyon and is 20 minutes from the small town. He drives and suddenly he sees something on the road. It's a man with his thumbs up. Baitar drives past the person, thinking to himself, why is there a person in the middle of the night standing there? He feels a chill inside his body, but he isn't bothered by that, since it's cold outside. Then all of a sudden, he looks in his mirror, and to his horror, there's a person sitting in his back seat. Just as he's going to look behind, the person says, don't look back, focus on driving instead. Baitar doesn't look back, but just focuses on the road. The person in the back seat starts talking. Drive me to the small town. I want to get off there, and don't look back. Baitar keeps on driving, never looking behind himself. It's a long 20-minute drive, but at last they arrive in the small town. He's just about to stop the car to let the man out, but there's no one in the back seat. He looks behind himself, and sure enough, there's no one there. He arrives home and tells his family about what he has experienced. His brother tells him that he met the hitchhiker. It's something that people have experienced between the canyon and the small town. They've encountered a person in the middle of the night with his thumbs up. If you don't pick him up, he'll appear in your car and tell you to stop at the small town where he wants to get off. Then after that, he was suddenly just vanished. So this is something that happened 2 years after World War II. So there's a reindeer herder. Let's call him Mikael. It was a beautiful morning. Mikael woke up early, ate breakfast, and was going to check on his reindeer. He takes his wooden skis and starts skiing. He skis over the tundra, returning 3 reindeer that has gone a bit too far. Hours go by, and he's almost done with his round. He then notices 20 reindeer grazing a bit away from the herd. He doesn't move them, as the grazing seems to be good there. He keeps on going, and skis on top a small mountain. He decides to sit there, as he has a good vantage point, and he can see his whole herd, as well as the neighbouring herds. When he's just about to leave, he hears a faint sound. Ooh, ooh. He stops and starts thinking of what the sound was. Probably just my neighbours that have been drinking and are yelling. He sits a bit longer, and again he hears it. Ooh, ooh. Then he sees the 20 reindeer sprinting back to the herd. He looks around, and on the other mountain he sees nothing. Until he sees something. It's something black. It's too far away to clearly see what it is, but it's spooked his reindeer. Mikael decides to go and check it out. Just as he starts skiing, he hears it again. Hoo hoo. Getting annoyed, he starts moving faster. Now he sees the thing is also moving towards him. He decides to stop at a hilltop and wait for it. Now the thing is close enough that he can see it's a human. He wonders why the person is walking instead of skiing. The person disappears out of view, but Mikael keeps on waiting. Then suddenly, hoo hoo. The person comes to view. Mikael's eyes turn wide open and his hairs stand up. This man doesn't have a head and is walking straight towards him. Mikael is in shock, but manages to snap back as the headless man and dodges just in time. Mikael starts skiing as fast as possible, not looking back no matter what. But he hears behind him. The thing is chasing him. He hears as the headless man is breaking snow as he runs behind Mikael. Even though Mikael is on skis and is moving quite fast, the headless man is keeping up with him. Then suddenly, the headless man stomps Mikael's skis, making him stuck in the snow. Mikael makes a cross with his fingers just in time. The headless man stops and just looks at him. While it's distracted, Mikael is able to break free. He then starts skiing again. He's skiing all he can, but he hears the footsteps closing in. He looks behind, seeing as the headless man is sprinting after him. It closes in on Mikhail again, and sure enough, stomps the skis. Mikhail makes a cross again with his fingers. The headless man stops and just looks at Mikhail. He breaks free and starts skiing again. He thinks to himself, he can't continue like this. He's going to tire out soon. Then he remembers something. There's a small cabin at a small lake, belonging to a local farmer that uses it when hunting and fishing. He skis up a mountain with the headless man right behind him. When he reaches the top, he can hear the cabin. He starts getting quite a lot of speed when going downhill. He looks behind and sees the headless man can't keep up with him. He just hears hoo hoo behind him, but doesn't look back. He reaches the cabin and locks the door. Mikhail makes a cross out of the logs inside and quickly makes a fire. He's heard from his grandma that ghosts don't like fire. He finds a Bible and starts reading it. It's quiet. The hours go by and all he hears is the wind and a faint fox screaming. Mikhail sits there and reads the Bible, not letting the fire die. He starts to think to himself, what in the hell is that thing? He then notices the clothes, that they seemed familiar to him. Then he remembers, his cousin used to have those clothes. His cousin got his head blown up by German soldiers during the war. He's starting to get tired and is half sleeping. Then suddenly, hoo hoo, and a loud knock on the door. It's the headless man, and he's trying to break in. Mikhail does the Lord's Prayer as fast as he can. Knocking stops. The next day, the sun is shining bright. Mikhail has made a cross of small sticks and decides to make a run for it. There's a small town not too far away. His hometown. He puts on his skis and looks around before starting to ski. He reaches the edge of the tundra when he hears it. Hoo hoo. He looks back and sure enough, it's the headless man walking towards Mikhail. Mikhail doesn't hesitate, but starts skiing as fast as possible. The way to the town is mostly downhill, so he goes quite fast. He only looks back once and sees the headless man standing there. He reaches the town and goes straight to one of the elders. No one knows what happens there, but Mikhail was never the same. This happy young man became scared and nervous, never going outside. He said to people that whoever wants can go and get this reindeer herd if they want to. So many people went and got Mikhail's reindeer and brought them to their own herd. The last someone ever saw of Mikhail was that he had bought a gun and was going hunting.